This is the Life and Mission Podcast. I'm Kay Helm, and today my guest is Eric Nevins. We're talking about podcasting, platforms, and the opportunities that podcasting presents to people like you with a message. Well, hey, Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Kay. It's good to be here.
Awesome. I got to know you through the Christian Podcasters Association. And we were laughing before we started recording because I keep calling you the pastor of the association. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah. Okay. So that's funny. What's interesting is I kind of function that way in many ways of just kind of bringing people together and helping people through whatever podcasting crisis might be coming up. But I think there is a spiritual element of podcasting.
Mm-hmm.
I really believe that people who start podcasts, you find your voice in a way that maybe other opportunities don't offer. And I think that's really important for spiritual maturity is knowing your voice. So yeah, that's what I do. But Christian Podcasters Association, it's started as a Facebook group that was just free on Facebook. And when I started, there weren't many groups for Christian podcasters. There's quite a few more now, I noticed, but we were kind of one of the beginning ones.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to bring Christian podcasters together. And so is to have them connect and learn and grow and support each other in this mission. What I love about it is we have podcasters from all kinds of denominational backgrounds. I spent enough time in my 20s arguing about theology. We don't have to do that now. So, but we all get along and we support each other. We guest on each other's shows. We, share whatever and guest and all those things. So it's really a fun community to get together.
Yeah. And that's a key word, community. That's podcasting can be a solitary, lonely thing. And everybody's out there going, okay, is anybody listening?
Yep. That's right. Well, that's exactly why I started it. So I started in 2016 and, my first year was, slow, right? It takes a while to build and to grow, and you're kind of alone, like my office is in my basement. So I'm in, my basement talking to myself or talking to the wall and just wondering, is anybody going to hear this? You hear the guru say things like, oh, ask for reviews or ask for feedback. But the reality is most people, when they're listening to a podcast, they're doing something else. They're doing the dishes. Most people actually listen to podcasts at home. Did you know that? So I thought it might be driving, right? I thought it might be driving, but it's not. It's like, so when they're doing dishes, cooking, cleaning, stuff like that. So they're busy. They're not like going to sit down and write you an email. So having people in your life that actually get that and can understand what you're doing with your show is really helpful.
Yeah, so true. And it really is a supportive community too. I wanted to have you on here as a guest on Life and Mission because I hear you speak about podcasting. And I think, sometimes we see it like, remember when blogging was the big thing and everybody was starting a blog, and it was, a lot of it was, I'm going to journal publicly.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people see podcasts like that now, but I see you as seeing it as really something greater. And I wonder if you could just let us into, what do you see?
Oh yeah. Well, I love that you asked this question because I agree with you. Here's the thing to ask yourself. So blogging was popular like 2008, right? 2009, somewhere in there. How many of those I'm just going to journal blogs are still out there, right? Mm-hmm. Or got famous or got a book deal or got, the answer is zero, right? Not very many of them. The ones that did well and went on to have other success were the ones that had a specific aim and a specific mission that they were or journey that they were inviting somebody into, right? So, so I think that's completely true with podcasting as well. And I don't see podcasting as just a fad. I know that I'm starting to hear jokes like, oh, everybody's got a podcast. And that's true. It seems like there are a lot, but there's only 2.4 million podcasts out there actually, right? So it's not as many as you think. And within the Christian category, I think it's like 80,000 or something. It's not actually as many as you would think. But having said, if you have a specific mission, you know who you're talking to, you know what you're trying to serve them with. For my show, it's called Halfway There. I was wanting to share with people that the journey of life with God is longer, deeper, and wider than they had been told. And there's more to it, even if you go through it, what's called the dark night of the soul, spiritual desert, hitting the wall, whatever you want to call it. That was what I wanted to do. And so that's what I've done. I've got people to tell me their stories, and we've done okay. The same thing with other shows, right? I think if as long as you have your mission, you know what you're doing, who you're trying to reach and why, man, you can't be stopped. And here's the other thing I like to say. In the 19th century, we sent people around the world, right? All over the place. In the 21st century, I think we're going to send content around the world, and podcasting is going to be an integral part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. You think about podcasts can go places where people can't go very easily.
Right. I mean, just ask how many people get downloads from countries that are otherwise, locked and you can't get in there, but the internet can.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. And, we hear a lot about, all the different types of content that's out there on the internet, and we can complain or we can put out a different kind of content.
Right. You can either be apart from it or a part of it. Right. And so there's probably a deeper conversation if you've ever read Christ and Culture, Richard Niebuhr. Like, there's all these different ways of approaching it. And I've always been one of the people who's more like Christ changing culture. You know what I mean? Like Christ kind of and culture kind of together. Because I think certainly the gospel, the kingdom of God needs to be brought to bear on the cultures that we've got. And so that's been what I've tried to do with Christian Podcasters Association.
Yeah, that's awesome. As you were saying that, I was thinking about, I was a theater major in college, and, the theater started in the church as a way to spread the gospel and to start discipling people, especially because people didn't read. So you had to act out the stories. So there's a lot of acting. And then it just, it got more and more kind of out there and making it more about the spectacle, and got away from the message a little bit. And then the church just kind of kicked it to the curb and said, no, this is not godly. And just like, if you were in the theater, you couldn't be buried in the church graveyard. And it was just did a total 180 from where it had started. But when we do that, we separate ourselves from not only from the culture, but from any influence we had there. And we hand this massive communications tool over.
Yes. And that's not the first or the only thing, right? So we've done with academia, we've done that with a lot of other places. I think it comes from this perception that if you don't agree with me, we can't be, affiliated or in relationship at all. But you have a relationship, you've just decided that it's an antagonistic one, right? So decide, what to be. But I don't think we see Jesus doing that. He was in relationship with a lot of people which is, gave the Pharisees a lot of license to criticize him. And yet, I think arguably he was probably the best at spreading his own message, right? So maybe that's what we need to do.
Yeah, I love it. You mentioned you do have this wonderful podcast, and I love the interviews that you do, because it's like not a highlight reel kind of interview.
Yeah.
But you just had your 300th episode.
Yeah, pretty cool.
That is. Congratulations. That's quite a milestone.
Yeah. So when I hit 100 episodes, I thought, okay, this is cool. But even 300 is kind of a wild number to me. I've already decided I'm going to do 500. I'm going to do it for 10 years, one every week for 10 years, right? That'll be it. But it's been cool. I've got to meet so many amazing people. I've learned so much about the spiritual journey along the way, which I kind of expected, but I'm surprised at how much I've learned and how wonderful that is, really, to see the work of God in people's lives. One of the things I always pray now for people before we start is I just acknowledge that the person in front of me, their story is part of God's story, and so there's sort of this holy moment to get to hear a little bit of what God's done in the world. That's kind of cool. That's a really amazing just honor to be part of.
Yeah, truly is. Tell us about Halfway There, and I'm interested in the name as well, and how you came up with the name, and just kind of tell us the story of Halfway There.
Yeah. So it took me 2 years to start my podcast because I was working in the financial industry, because I graduated from seminary right at the end of the downturn or in the middle of the downturn. That was not a good time to graduate from seminary. We're in a lot of jobs. And you know what? In retrospect, the Lord protected me. I was pretty immature. I think I can look at now and go, oh, yeah, well, all right. That's probably a good idea. But I still wanted to contribute to that spiritual formation conversation. And so eventually I discovered podcasting. I knew I wanted to do something about the spiritual journey, but I'd also had this experience where I realized that stories were really important. I read, of all things, it's actually a book about politics by Oz Guinness, who I actually got to talk to on my show. It's pretty great.
Yes, I listened to
I've
that episode.
I've talked to
Yes.
him a couple times, and it was so good. And I asked him about it. But he kind of made the point that, it's really character in our society that matters. It doesn't matter what's written in the Constitution if nobody's going to follow it. So I started asking the question, well, how do I actually shape character? And then I realized through a variety of things that actually cultures have always used stories to shape character. And so that's why my show is. So I made the choice to actually interview people and have them tell me their stories. I try to go beyond the interview, or beyond the idea of, like, when I was a kid, the testimony was, my life was terrible, then I met Jesus, and now my life is great, right? That's just
Right.
wonderful,
Yep.
except for all the other things that happen during life, right? Or all
Yep.
after that. So I wanted to tell that whole story about what it's like to go through a dark night of the soul and to feel like God has abandoned you, and to feel like he's not coming through. And then how does that resolve? Because ultimately it does. I talk about Habakkuk on my show all the time. That's his experience, right? He's mad at God, but it ends in this tremendous poem of worship that's probably one of my favorites in the Bible. Okay, so you asked about the name. Halfway there, I'll never forget the moment, because I was trying to think of names, and I was driving home from work, and I had all kinds of things I wanted to call it, but they were too vanilla, right? They were too just like, I don't like that. It's just boring. And so I ended up, I'm a big Bon Jovi fan, so I always say it's a little bit one part hat tip to Bon Jovi. If you can leave, think singing Living on a Prayer, you'll probably never forget the name of my podcast. That was my thinking.
It's playing in my head now.
Exactly. That's what I mean. Like, it's so good. I could take advantage of Bon Jovi. I got to see him a couple times here in Denver too. But that was kind of it. But then also there's this idea that the spiritual journey is not, like, we're never going to get there. There is no place that we arrive at, even in eternity. My third interview, I was hanging out with my buddy that I interviewed for that interview, named Bill Brown. He says to me on that episode, he goes, I don't think that we'll ever be able to exhaust the knowledge of an infinite God. He will always be surprising us. Whoa. Like, that just blew me away, right? Yeah, that's right. So that's why I have the name halfway there. You're going to be on the journey, and we may as well just embrace that we're on the journey wherever we are now.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I had not heard the story of the beginning of halfway. I definitely would have remembered the Bon Jovi part.
I'm such a glam metal fan. It's so cheesy now, but I love it. I love all that stuff. I'll go back and, man, the day before high school, we stood outside. We didn't even have tickets, so we stood outside at the Iowa State Fairgrounds to watch Nelson. Do you remember Nelson? They were like a glam rock band with the long blonde hair. Awesome guitar solos. I love it.
Those were the days, right?
Yeah. They don't make music like that anymore.
No. As you interview people for halfway there, and you said you just didn't want to tell that kind of, it was bad, then I met Jesus, then it was good story, because you're so right. I mean, I think that really, we have this kind of, if that's the view we have, and that's the only picture we have of Christianity, then we can never, like you say, get there. We can never get there, so we don't bother.
Right. Well, I think it's simplistic, and that's, I get it. That makes sense for giving a speech, right? Is to explain, these sort of things, but that's not the way lives work, right? So we have to tell the bigger story. And so one of the questions I always ask is, have you been through a dark night of the soul? Some people don't get that if you're, not Catholic, like that's John of the Cross. A book that was really influential to me is called The Critical Journey by Janet Hagberg and Robert Gulick. And that describes the spiritual journey. So I kind of just adopted their their steps, and I walk through those phases in almost every interview. It's very, very similar, but you'd be surprised at the diversity and breadth of experiences that we actually get. I've been really interested to hear from a bunch of different people in different regions of the world and the country, in the United States especially. But I try to get outside when I can. But like, you know, Portland, somebody who grew up in Portland has a very different experience from somebody who grew up in Atlanta, right?
Yeah,
But
true.
spiritually, or Texas, or fascinating. For some reason, I keep interviewing people from Indianapolis or around Indiana recently. Like, what's that about? I don't know, but they have a very similar sort of Christian experience, and then they go different ways, whatever. But that fascinates me, and I'm kind of a student of it.
Oh, it's so cool. And I love hearing the stories from different places, different people, different cultures, because God is so much bigger than our neighborhood,
Right. Right.
and
He does things, and he uses things you would not expect.
yeah,
Right. So that there's, for some, I did 2 interviews kind of right around the same time. One was John Schlitt, who was the lead singer of Petra. He got thrown out of a rock band for doing too much cocaine. Right. Like, I don't know how much. It was a secular rock band. I don't know how much cocaine you have to do to get thrown out of a secular rock band, but he did a lot. So anyway, he ends up coming to Christ, and then he gets this gig with Petra, right, and sharing his story all over the world. The other one that I love was a guy who was like the country's most prolific bank robber when he was a teenager, right? Like, he, more than Dillinger, more than, like, he was up there, and he ends up finding Christ because a college, guy who was studying to be a pastor gave him a Bible and didn't judge him for where his life was. And he tells him, "Hey, I want to go home and do my coke and read the Bible." And he says, "Here you go ahead." And the lack of judgment really influenced him. And by morning, he had read through the entire New Testament. Like, he just read front to back, and gave his life to Christ. Right? Like, what? Now he helps people all over the country. He's helped homeless people and other people who've been kind of in his position. So God can use anything. That's what I've learned. And there's a whole ton of other great stories, but that's one of my favorites.
yeah, those are cool. I mean, yeah, God's not held back.
Right.
It's kind of our own.
Right.
We can
We
hesitate.
are. Yeah, we are, but he's not, and he can use anybody and anything. And so it behooves us to kind of pay attention to that and just be ready.
Okay, I'm going to bring up kind of, I guess, can be a sore subject these days. I mean, there's going to be a gap between recording this podcast and releasing it. So, anything can happen, right? And the last couple of years has shown us that. But, there's in some churches, they're just rolling along just fine. And others, there's some conflict. Do we meet in person? Do we meet inside, outside? Do we meet with masks? Do we meet without masks? What do we do? What do we do? Now that, if you consider the pandemic over, do we just shut down all the stuff that we were doing online? What do you see? Again, going back to that original question of what you saw with podcasting, but now podcasting as something that the church might use in this new day where we see people, picking up technology that maybe they wouldn't have picked up, 2.5, 3 years ago.
Yeah. My hope, and I've been hopeful for 2 years, I've been thus far disappointed, but there are people starting to talk about this. My hope is that local churches will start to understand the value of what is called new media, right? New media is podcasting. It is blogging. It is like online books. It is YouTube videos, things like that. And begin to understand that their reach goes beyond the people who walk in their door on a Sunday morning. It's great if you're a charismatic teacher, and we need charismatic teachers. We need people who can explain the word in a way that everybody can get. But we also need to not limit ourselves now, because we don't have to, right? It's like if we had, I'm sure there was somebody in the church at the beginning in the 1500s when the printing press was invented who just thought books were evil or something. I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not, but you know what I mean? Like it'd be like that. Just saying, oh,
Yeah.
books are books. We're just not going to worry about writing books. Are you kidding me? No. You have that opportunity to go around the world and share your message, to create courses. I don't know many churches. Man, it's how easy is it to take a Sunday sermon series and turn it into an online course, right?
Mhm.
Take some work to do it well and to do it really good, but then you can give that resource. I know some churches are doing this, but give that then a resource, give it away for free, and give it to your small groups to go through, or to give it to anybody's small group if they see it to go through, or you can charge for it if that's helpful, like whatever. There's a variety of options depending on what works for you. But I would love to see more churches step away from the sermon content, or it's fine, do the sermon. Like I'm happy for you to podcast your sermon. Podcasting is the new tape ministry. That's fine. I get it.
Yep.
But also think about the ways that you can engage with people online that involves them, right? So
Yes.
I write for Podcast Magazine, and one thing I do in the review section all the time, where I write a review of different shows, is I critique podcasts and churches specifically who will only do a sermon podcast, because I think you're missing something. I think you're not using the technology that's available to you. I know it takes time, and so I give. There's a lot of grace, right? But I'm also want to give the challenge. Hey, think about it, because maybe your ministry needs to reach more people, not just the ones that come in your door, but the ones who need it and what God's laying on your heart around the world.
Yeah, and think about the devices that we consume our media on. It's not a one-way device anymore. Like it's not a
Right.
TV.
Right.
This is where the person sits passively while you speak at them. It's a phone and or a computer, and that's a two-way device.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
Which is one of my problems with if the extent of your church's technological reach is streaming your sermon or your service on Sunday, that's okay. Like I'm sure there are people that need that. I'm not, but if that's it, apply some creativity, right? Like maybe there's some other things that you can do, and maybe you can ask some questions and be curious and make it not all about what you're creating. Maybe you can invite some other people to create or to answer some questions. Early in the pandemic, I started doing a Zoom call. This is like when everything went down. And so for our
yeah,
church, I did a Zoom call and I facilitated it for 6 or 7 months just to help people it was kind of the lobby, right? It's a spiritual lobby, and after church, everybody hangs out in the lobby and talks. That's
yeah,
what I
yeah.
was allowing people to do, because we didn't have time to do that. We couldn't, it was just missing and gone all of a sudden. And it wasn't about me. It wasn't about me looking good or, whatever. It was about everybody talking and sharing their lives together. And social media and new media offers that opportunity.
Yeah, I've been part of a small group for much of the pandemic now. It meets once a week by Zoom. And, I moved away. It's a 40-minute drive now to across the river and through the woods to church. But it's, we're open now, but I still love this Zoom group.
Yeah.
And we really do share. We've all said we would attend it more faithfully than
Yeah.
if we were doing it in live. So we
Right.
decided to just keep doing it by Zoom.
See, I've been talking to a lot of people on my podcast about a lot. I'm going to say a handful, three or four people who've written books about and kind of encouraging us to let's get back to embodiment and let's get back to these things are really important. And I agree, but I also don't think it's taking it seriously, right? I think there is something we can be encouraged through a Zoom, right? Is it nice if somebody can give me a pat on the back? Sure. But if you can give me an encouraging word over Zoom, that's great. Like I'm happy to have it still, right? So I don't think we should diminish it. I think we need to harness it.
Yeah, it's good. Just even that two-way kind of thing and just finding new ways to do things. One of the things that's been really helpful for me is I get a text every now and then from somebody at church, either the pastor or associate pastor or somebody on staff. Hey, how you doing? What's up? They might call, might text, but
Yeah.
there's just this, it's how can we do the interaction that we've been missing? However, it's kind of like any way you can, that's how to do it. And it doesn't have to be an either or thing. It can be a
Right.
both and.
Absolutely. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. What do you think is the future of podcasting?
I worry about that all the time. I think about it. But every time I do, I go back to those statistics. There's 2.4 million podcasts right now. About 600, I think it was 677,000. So about 26% only have one episode. Right. And then when you break it down between the 19 different categories in Apple Podcasts, there actually aren't that many. And then in the Christian category, maybe there's 80,000, something like that. That's not as it's like the category that has the most number of shows with the least number of listens. The opposite of the Christian category is true crime, has the least number of shows and the most number of listens, which I guess kind of makes sense. But so when I would think about that and I wonder like what, it feels like it's saturated and everybody's got a podcast and there's that. But I actually think there's more room. And I think we're going to see some creators who get really, really creative, who have niches that are interesting and unique and maybe Christian adjacent, I'll say, where their faith isn't necessarily their main thing, but they are speaking to Christians and they're going to do very, very well. I think we saw the rise and fall of Mars Hill last year blow up, right? I also got to talk to the Bible in a Year podcast that was at the top of the charts all year, like him and the rise and fall. So those, you're going to see some people do that really well. But I do think you're going to see more churches and more pastors embrace the podcast as a means of discipleship. And I welcome it.
And you don't have to have a big crowd. I mean, my podcast host, I was lamenting, that I didn't have, this was maybe a year and a half ago, maybe even 2 whole years ago. And I was just like, well, I was a little discouraged because of my download numbers. And she said, Kay, you have a church of this size that you're caring for. She says, think about that. Go take care of your people. Changed everything.
Well, right. Exactly. So if just however many, we can throw out a number like 75. So say you get 75 downloads an episode. If you had 75 people coming to your living room, that would feel really full, right? To hear you talk or filling up a room, you'd be like, oh, you'd be a little nervous. So it is good to keep that in mind. I just want to see people be creative about the shows that they create and who they're trying to serve and think of podcasting as a discipleship tool.
That's great. That's great. Well, Eric, I'm going to thank you for being on the show. I look up to you. You're a leader in this space that I have a lot of respect for. And I thank you for the work that you do for Christian podcasters. Tell us real quick about your podcast and where we can find you.
Yeah, my podcast is called Halfway There, and it's available any place you get podcasts. I say it's honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience. It's kind of a testimony show, but we try to go beyond the traditional testimony. I think you'll like it. And you can find me at ericnevins.com. That's everything you need is there.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.